is the basis of all independence.
Hello, this is Dr. V's Revolution. Will not be pesticides. In this video, I'm going to talk about why a vote for the Democrats or the Republicans is a vote for the state, and why I believe that a vote for the state is a vote that is against you and against your liberty and against your freedom. Now, I actually haven't voted in years. This is 2020. Last time I voted for the President of the United States was in the year 2008. Now, why is a vote for the state a vote against you? Well, in order to understand this, you have to realize that our ancestors were anti-state. Now this gets to the point of, what's more important, liberty or security. Now, when you belong to a centralized state, yes, you are secure. You're secure from being sold into slavery into the Americas. But how free are you? See, a lot of these West African societies, before the rise of the centralized state as a result of the transatlantic slave trade in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, a lot of them lived in freer, open societies. They lived in societies what Ife Amajume would call an anti-state society. Some historians refer to it as stateless society. Some of them refer to it as decentralized societies or acephalous societies. But these were societies without a head, societies without large centralized apparatus, state structure. But they were societies structured in a way because were structured this way because they placed more importance on liberty and freedom than they did on security. Like Benjamin Franklin once said, any society that's willing to give up their freedom for security will deserve neither and lose both. Now, there are many decentralized societies or anti-state societies all along the coast of West Africa. Now, inherently, decentralized societies don't have stratification within those societies. And societies without stratification don't practice slavery. So, if you look at a society like the Igbo society from southeast Nigeria, they were described by the British when the British arrived there as having what they called organized anarchy. They essentially didn't believe in being ruled. Our ancestors, when you go back to the western coast of West Africa, and you realize that there were different groups like the Igbo, the Ibibio, the Ewe, and other West African groups all along the coast that lived a life that was known as, by many anthropologists, as being anti-state societies. Not necessarily acknowledging these people as failing to achieve something, right? That's what stateless implies, that you failed to achieve statehood. But no, it's actually quite the opposite. They're anti-state people, meaning that they consciously made a decision, made an effort to actually avoid becoming a part of the state. It's like the Igbo, for instance. The Igbo were what they refer to as an acephalous anti-state society. Now the Igbo, if you go all the way back to as far back as 2000 BC, they've had elements of their society that was becoming stratified. They were iron smelters, iron producers. There's the Igbo bronzes of the 9th century. There's written language called Nsibidi in Igbo society. All these things that are an indication of a centralized sort of system existing throughout the Igbo society. But despite the fact that they had these elements of centralization within their society, the Igbo people throughout the southeast region of present-day Nigeria, what is also known as the Bida Biafra region, these people made an effort to stay away from centralization, because centralization of society meant discord. Discord meant no harmony. And the Igbo believed in the purpose of harmony. Igbo believed in harmony. That was the most important part of their society. That was the most important part in order to make life flow and to make things flow naturally, is you had to make sure that there was harmony. So this is what the ancestors were. Even when you go back to a place like the Congo might have had certain elements. They might have had what they call a monarchy, but the monarchy was very different from the way we see monarchies in the Western Hemisphere. They had very democratic institutions, and the monarchical society of the Kingdom of the Congo was very decentralized. The Ewe people were also an anti-state group. All right, these were groups of people who wanted to avoid being controlled by state apparatus. The Igbo believe in this philosophy that the Igbo has no ruler. The Igbo has no king. The British, the French, all of them, they had their stereotypes, they had their characteristics of certain ethnic groups from Africa. But the Igbo particularly were considered to be a very, what they called a low-grade group of Negro, and very despondent and very prone to suicide and running away. So where does this come from? Well, first, there are several examples. Like there was an example of this in off the coast of Georgia, what they call Igbo landing, right? There are a group of enslaved Africans, mostly Igbo, coming from the Bight of Biafra, that were getting ready to be sold off the coast of Georgia. These Africans all simultaneously committed suicide in a river, I believe was known as Dunbar Creek. These Igbo Africans committed mass suicide at this time. You also have the example, there was an example in Cuba that I was reading about, where Igbo Africans on a plantation all simultaneously committed suicide. Even in Dominica, they were characterized by the governor George Ainsley in the year 1814 as being predisposed to suicide, and they said this was one of the reasons that made them such great fighters in warfare, because they didn't care about death. In fact, they believed in the whole concept of give me liberty or give me death. Right? These Africans believed in liberty in the utmost way, right? And they were willing to die for that liberty. And to understand why these Africans had this predisposition to the suicide while being enslaved, you have to understand Igbo society. If you go back, the Igbo were what they called anthropologists, and everybody who's visited the region, they've known the Igbo to be an acephalous society. Right? What is acephalous? This is a society without a head. The Igbo did not believe in being ruled, nor did they believe in ruling others. This was a concept that came from their very understanding of the universe, all right, their understanding of the Uwa, all right. Now, they believed in living harmony with things and those around them. These people consciously made the decision not to be a part of a state. They were literally anti-state, anti-government type of group of people, because they believed that the government was inherently a controlling mechanism that took away people's liberty and took away people's freedom. And the government, in that sense, was an institution that created discord instead of harmony. Okay, so this is one of the things that's important to understand about the Igbo. They didn't like those concepts, and according to their understanding of the universe, this was anti-God and this was anti-harmony. And for the Igbo, God was harmony. There's an expression that goes, Igbo enwe ese. Igbo enwe ese means the Igbo has no king. The Igbo has no ruler. There was an ancestral staff known as the Ofo. And the Ofo represents truth, justice, and righteousness. Okay? Truth, justice, and righteousness. This is a staff that represented the ideals that was promoted in Igbo society. All right? There was also the Ikenga. Now, the Ikenga was another object that a lot of people, when the Westerners came into Nigeria, they looked at it as just a piece of artwork. But it also had very philosophical meanings for the Igbo people. And the Ikenga actually meant, it was the cult of achievement. It was about merit, okay? So Igbo society placed a lot of emphasis in the individual and the individual's merit. It was a meritocracy, in essence, all right? Now, this didn't mean that, you subjugated those who weren't able to achieve as much as you, but everybody's role, everybody's thing that they were good at, everybody's an individual, and everybody can achieve greatness in their individual field. And so this is one of the things about Igbo society that they place a lot of importance in, and this is why this society was a society that was it was egalitarian, because there was no more value put in the role of a woman than there was of a man. There was no more value put in the role of a man than a woman. Now, like I said before, the decentralization of Igbo society, right? Voting through general consensus. It wasn't because they didn't have the ability to form a hierarchical society. In fact, throughout their early history, they did have hierarchical societies. In fact, the Igbo people, if you go back far enough, you will see a very stratified, centralized society at times. But you see, the Igbo people made a conscious effort to avoid that kind of society. Even if you go and you ask somebody about when West Africans, reached the Iron Age, they would say, oh, they didn't reach the Iron Age until the colonials got there, and after the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885. But if you look at the Igbo people of Southeast Nigeria, in a small village called Leja, and a town called Nsukka, in Southeast Nigeria, there is evidence to point towards the fact that the Igbo people were actually smelting iron as far back as 2000 BC. You can read this article written by a woman by the name of Pamela Ese Usumaka. Being enslaved was the antithesis of their idea of life, and they were unwilling to accept it. And so when you see them committing suicide in such large numbers in America, and it was something that was so frowned upon in Africa, this was the society that they were living in was basically flipped upside down on its head. The Igbo people were a very phenomenal group. You see, they believed in very free concepts. They were what we in the West might refer to as an enlightened group of people. They believed in the concept of very, very limited, if no government at all. They were an anti-state society. They were what many might call libertarians in today's terms, and they believed in they were a meritocracy believing group of people as well. They placed a lot of emphasis in the individual, but the individual was also a part of a community. All right. And they believe that if you allow the individual to be free, then the community can function in harmony in a much better way and not have to worry about any type of discordance or anything like that going on. So was it Thomas Jefferson that came up with the concepts of that all men are created equal, and that the government proves and shows and demonstrates that it's unwilling or unable to keep the promises to the people, that the people have the right to overthrow or abolish that government? Was it him that came up with these concepts? Was it John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Paine that came up with the concepts of questioning their government and questioning the control that the government has over the people, that the people have the right to overthrow and abolish their governments? Or was it Patrick Henry that came up with the concept of give me liberty or give me death? Or did these concepts come out of Africa? Did they come out of the Baida Biafra region? Did they come out of the land of the Igbo, where the Igbo believed in the concept of egalitarian society based on individual freedom and liberty? Was it the Igbo that came into the Americas and forced the hand of this U.S. government to live up to its principles in the so-called founding documents? This is something to take into consideration. See, these Europeans put these things in words on these documents. But I think if you look at the actions of the Igbo and all their slave revolts that they engaged in, whether it was in Barbados, whether it was in Virginia, whether it was in Dominica, whether it was in Jamaica, and some of these other colonies throughout the West Indies, you'll find that they put in all their efforts to ensure the fact that they would rise up and revolt and gain their freedom by any means necessary. even when you go back, when you see these societies, once these same Africans got imported through the transatlantic slave trade into the Americas, what did they develop in various parts of the Americas? Whether you're talking about Brazil, whether you're talking about Jamaica, whether you're talking about Dominica, whether you're talking about Mexico, whether you're talking about Florida, whether you're talking about North Carolina and Virginia, whether you're talking about various parts of the Americas, no matter where you went, these same African people had still maintained this anti-state kind of philosophy, staying off the grid, staying away from colonialism, staying away from the grid, staying away from the state structure. These systems were called Maroon Communities. All right, this comes from the word cimarrón. Cimarrón was the word that was used to describe initially in Spanish societies runaway cattle that left the plantations to escape on top of the mountains. But then they started to use the word cimarrón to talk about the runaway slaves who did the same thing, escaped plantations, escaped the grid to run on top of the mountains to get away from so-called civilization. This word cimarrón had become debased through time and become adopted by other societies. In societies like the French, they adopted the word cimarrón and it became known as marron. All right, and then in French Creole, you hear it referred to as marron, neg marron. And in British society, they adopted the term cimarrón, became known as maroon. And then in a place like Spanish Florida, cimarrón, plural cimarrones, became known as cimanoles, and then cimanoles became known as Seminole. So all these terms describe the same thing. It was people trying to get away from the state. All right, that's very important to realize here. Even when you're looking at the Rastafarian culture in Jamaica, this is all about the state is Babylon.
A lot of people in the Caribbean associate Rastafarianism with crime. What do you have to say on this?
Well, I am saying that the people who is running the world today, they are the crimers, because not one of them is doing the right thing. All of them is outlaw. The Rasta man is the only righteous man on the face of the earth. All government is illegal. All government in the world today is illegal.
See, we as Rasta man don't live.
This is Jacob Killer Miller, and he's here. What you were saying now, Jacob?
We as Rasta man, we don't live by man law, we live by God law. See?
Babylonian society, Babylonian state. Get away from the state. Live off the land. Live free. All right? The state is coercive. The state initiates force. The state is violent. All these concepts are what the Africans realized, all right, when they came from the African continent and when they arrived in the Americas. But somehow, some way, through time, we've been convinced to believe that the state is our savior. So you got this so-called two-party system, right? This duopoly. It's like picking between Coke and Pepsi. Not much of an option, right? So every now and then, this pendulum switches back and forth from left to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right. And you think that you're getting some kind of change because the rhetoric of the individual changes, but the policies of the individuals are virtually the same. When you're picking the Democrats and you're picking the Republicans, you're picking a status. You're picking people that do not have your best interests at hand. And what you end up seeing is the right side of the aisle might have rhetoric that supports things that are very much so about liberation and freedom. But then they also support and are all for things that are against your liberation and freedom. And then the left side of the aisle might pick and support and talk about some things that are for your liberation and freedom, but then be against this opposite things that the other side of the aisle is for. And they would very much be against your liberation and freedom as well on the other side of the aisle. So instead of having, so this is what they're so slick with the way they do this. You have the red and the blue, you have the liberal and conservative, you have the Democrat, you have the Republican. But instead of having 100% of the people fighting for 100% liberation, what you end up having is you have 50% of the population voting to take away the freedoms, 50% of the freedoms on the left side of the aisle, and then on the right side of the aisle, you have 50% of the population voting to take away the other 50% of the freedoms. So instead of having 100% of the people voting for 100% freedoms, we have 50% of the population voting to take away 50% of the freedoms, and on the other side, you have 50% of the population voting to take away the other 50% of the freedoms. An example of this would be like if you have, for instance, the Republicans, for instance, they're about, like, at least rhetorically speaking, they talk about low taxes, they talk about the right to bear arms, they talk about these kinds of things, right? States' rights, more liberty in that sense. But the Republicans, for a very long time, though they've been all about small government, right, in that sense, they've supported for a very long time beefing up security in the United States, expanding the military. They've been all about the use of beefing up law and order, police forces, war on drugs. This has been their thing, right? Now on the other side of the aisle, you have the Democrats. The Democrats might be socially liberal, right? Get rid of some of the drug laws, etc., etc., etc. But at the same time, the Democratic Party seems to be want to thwart your Second Amendment right to bear arms. They want to infringe upon your First Amendment right to say certain things or to publish certain things. And so what you have is one side of the aisle voting to take away certain freedoms, the other side of the aisle voting to take away freedoms, and what you ultimately get at the end of the day is freedoms coming from both sides getting taken away, instead of a promotion of freedoms and a promotion of liberty. You're voting for a status, and the trajectory of the statism continues to go in the same direction, and that is less freedom. Now, this is just the way I feel. I'm not trying to convince anybody, but we've been convinced to vote for the Democratic Party for a long time. And I see a lot of these walk away videos where you see people all of a sudden, they realize that the Democrats have been using them and abusing them for a very long time. And then they walk away, and then they walk right into the Republican Party, thinking that they're somehow woke. But you walked right out of one plantation to walk right into another plantation. And neither one of these plantations have your best interests at hand. Well, you can go back for all the people that believe that the Republicans are extremely inherently racist and etc., and they're so loyal to the Democratic Party. Let's just look at a little bit of history of the Democratic Party. I'm not saying this as a Republican, because I'm definitely not that at all either. You can go back to the Democratic Party. You can find that as far back as the party really comes from Thomas Jefferson as an anti-federalist. But you really start to see the Democratic take its modern form with Andrew Jackson. Pro-slavery, pro-expansion, anti-Indian kind of rhetoric and policies with the Indian Removal Acts. The Democrats were all about expanding the country and getting more land to expand the Cotton Kingdom, right? The Democrats were the ones who seceded from the Union in 1860 and 1861, and fought as Confederates against the United States government. The Democrats failed to secede and create themselves an independent country. But then you have Democrats like Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated, who continued to push. He rescinded on the policy to redistribute land to African Americans after the Civil War. He did everything he could to block any type of progress. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, and he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, right, until these things were overridden by the Republican Congress. Keep going down the line, you see the Democrats such as Woodrow Wilson, who segregated Washington, D.C. Woodrow Wilson, who showed the film Birth of a Nation in the White House and gave it all kinds of praise for its historical accuracy. Birth of a Nation being the film that depicted the Ku Klux Klan as being a heroic organization at the time of Reconstruction. But then, we all know that. We all know that Woodrow Wilson, we all know that Andrew Johnson and Andrew Jackson, as Democrats, were on the wrong side of history. Right, that's what we tend to think about. But then, when we get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we start to think that this is when the Democrats started to become good. But even if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's administration, you see a lot of problems as well. There is a book by Walter Williams called Race and Economics, where he actually details a lot of the Roosevelt New Deal policies that were actually detrimental to the black community. As much as it was presented as being something favorable to the black community. One of the things people don't really understand is that during the whole Roosevelt era, like, Roosevelt was elected 4 times in a row. These were hard times for all of America. And Roosevelt kind of had this way with the people and used to give these messages on television every so often to kind of connect himself with the people. And people put so much trust and so much faith in Roosevelt. In the same way that people started to put so much trust and faith in Lincoln. It's almost as if this whole concept of, you know, the nanny state coming there to save you and rescue you is the solution to all problems with some of these people. Not even realizing that it was partially the nanny state. Well, it was really the nanny state that created this economic situation in the first place. But people don't realize a lot of black people started voting Democrat during the Roosevelt years. Even about 2/3 of African Americans started voting Democrat, even though about 50% were still registered as Republicans. They started to vote Democrat, not so much because of Franklin Roosevelt's policies were actually good for black people, but more so because of some of his rhetoric and some of the good deeds that his wife Eleanor Roosevelt was actually doing for the black community at the time. But Roosevelt's policies himself weren't that great. And if you look at who Roosevelt was working with in Congress, Congress at the time was dominated by the Democrats. But Democrats during this time, in the 1930s and 40s, were still Southern segregationist Dixiecrats. So a Democrat was the same thing as a Dixiecrat at this time.
The system of government that America has consists of committees. There are 16 senatorial committees that govern the country and 20 congressional committees. 10 of the 16 senatorial committees are in the hands of Southern racialist senators who are racialists. 13 of the 20, this was before the last election. I think it's even more so now. 10 of the 16 committees, senatorial committees, are in the hands of senators who are Southern racialists. 13 of the 20 congressional committees were in the hands of Southern congressmen who are racialists, which means out of the 36 committees that govern the foreign and domestic direction of that government, 23 are in the hands of Southern racialists, men who in no way believe in the equality of man, and men who do anything within their power to see that the black man never gets to the same seat or to the same level that they are on. The reason that these men from that area have that type of power is because America has a seniority system. And these who have that seniority have been there longer than anyone else because the black people in the areas where they live can't vote. And it is only because the black man is deprived of his vote that puts these men in positions of power that gives them such influence in the government beyond their actual intellectual or political ability, or even beyond the number of people from the areas that they represent.
So in order for him to get any type of bill passed, New Deal bill passed, he had to make sure he had to appease these same Southern Democrats, these same Southern Dixiecrats. All right, and this is what essentially happened. A lot of the policies that were being implemented at this time were racist, segregationist kind of policies, because he had to appease and appeal to his constituency, and he had to appeal to the same ones in Congress that were actually gonna vote some of these policies through. Let me give you an example. There was the National Industrial Recovery Act, there was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and there was the Federal Housing Administration, and there was the Social Security Act, there was the Wagner Act, and also the Fair Labor Standards Act. And when we look at all these acts, for instance, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 was an act that it restricts output and it forces a minimum wage.
Most people in this town view the state and a lot of the government programs and taxation programs as aiding minorities, and especially blacks. And you're making the argument in your writings for 30, 40 years and in your book that, in fact, policies like the minimum wage, the expansion of the welfare state, have actually been a setback for minorities. How do you defend yourself against your critics?
Well, if you look at the minimum wage, most Americans support the minimum wage and increase in the minimum wage because they have good intentions. They think that, gee, it will help low-skilled people earn higher living. But when you look at public policy, you should not look at the intentions behind public policy. You should ask the question, what are the effects? And you can see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And you say, and you have to pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Well then, would you hire a worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would only enable him to produce $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. That is to pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody could only produce $4 worth of value per hour. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. And if you look at
wait a minute, those are the people who are going to get the minimum wage.
No, they're not going to get a job in the first place. That is, there's the lowest skilled people, the employer just will not hire them. Now, in the absence of a minimum wage law, if he could pay them $3 or $4 an hour, $5 an hour, well, they could be employed and they would learn something on the job. They get on-the-job training and ultimately be worth $7.25 or even more than that. So what the minimum wage law does, it cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. And if you look for the empirical evidence of this, you just look at our labor force and you see that the unemployment rate among teenagers is the highest. And teenagers are low skilled because they lack the experience and maturity and other attributes of adults. And among that group are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of often going to rotten schools, getting fraudulent education, poor backgrounds, rotten neighborhoods, and early work experiences are very, very important for people who have this kind of background. Now, there's something else about the minimum wage law that nobody considers, and I point that out in a book I wrote in 1989. It's called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. And in that book, I do a study of labor markets in South Africa during its apartheid era. And I give citation after citation of racist unions in South Africa who would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wage high enough so that employers would not hire black workers, they would hire white workers. So it turns out that the minimum wage is the most effective tool in the arsenal of racists everywhere in the world. And let me just give one more example on minimum wage law. The first minimum wage law in our country was the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. And the Davis-Bacon Act says that all workers in federally funded or federally assisted construction projects must be paid the prevailing wage. And if you look on page 6513 of the Congressional Record on March 31st, 1931, you'll see congressional testimony where congressmen will say, see that contractor over there? He brings cheap colored labor up from the South, puts them in cabins, and it's labor of that sort that has to compete, that white Americans are competing against. It was all kinds of testimony in support of the Davis-Bacon Act that demonstrated that they wanted to keep blacks out of construction. Wow. And see, the tragedy of it is that the Davis-Bacon Act is still on the books today. And another part of the tragedy is that black congressmen, they also support the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, they support the Davis-Bacon Act because unions want the Davis-Bacon Act. Now, the people who support the Davis-Bacon Act today, they just don't use the same rhetoric. They use a more enlightened rhetoric in support of the Davis-Bacon Act. But the minimum wage law, any kind of minimum or any kind of regulation on prices, it discriminates against less preferred people. I mean, if you ask the question, and one example I frequently give talking about setting prices, any kind of price control, it discriminates against less preferred people. I often ask people, suppose you saw a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man, and he's married to a beautiful young lady. What kind of prediction would you make about that man's income? You would guess that it's pretty high. And what is he doing? He's telling the beautiful young lady, look, I can't compete for your hand on the basis of a guy like Williams. So I'm going to offset my handicap by offering you a higher price. And so decent people might say, well, gee, is it fair for beautiful young ladies to treat fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men any differently than they treat handsome men? And they'll say no. And then you make a law saying that beautiful young ladies can't charge fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking men higher prices than they charge handsome men. Then you say, well, then what happens to the probability of a fat, old, ugly, cigar-smoking man marrying a beautiful young lady? What you've done by regulating prices, you've taken away his most effective means of competing with the more preferred man by offering higher prices. And so that's the same thing when you regulate any price. You handicap less preferred people.
When leading up into the New Deal, all of these policies, what it ended up doing was it increased the unemployment rate of young African Americans at the time. As a result of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, 500,000 blacks in the South lost their jobs as a result. Also, with the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, the federal government paid farmers not to produce. And what this did is it made a lot of field hands throughout the South also lose their jobs as a result. There was also the Federal Housing Administration of 1934. The government insured these loans to make sure that they're constructing suburbia. But the stipulations with these loans, it excluded blacks from living and being able to get loans to live in some of these homes in suburbia. And what it virtually did was this policy of the Federal Housing Administration, it created, a segregated America. And even parts of America that were not segregated, that were not in the South, you would end up seeing them become segregated as a result. People were struggling for housing, but if you were going to get housing under this new federal policy, they were funneling the blacks into housing projects, and they were funneling the whites into suburbia. And this is where you start to see the segregation of society, not only in the South, but also in some of the major cities all throughout the United States that were not previously segregated. Housing projects were built for blacks. And this is where you get redlining from. Also, the Social Security Act of 1935. Same thing. There were certain jobs that were covered under the Social Security Act, meaning you can get money after your retirement age. Certain jobs were excluded. You know what these jobs were? Field hands was one. Domestics was another. Why? Because these are the jobs that black people had in the South. and they didn't want any black people to get lazy after the age of 65. There was also the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act. It encouraged labor union monopolies. See, this act, the National Labor Relations Act, or also known as the Wagner Act, it encouraged a monopoly of unions, right? The same unions that excluded blacks, the same unions that encouraged minimum wages, to price out the black worker, were the ones that are now being solely recognized. They were basically sponsored by the federal government. These unions were sponsored by the federal government, so these unions got all the jobs, and especially in all the industries that were now getting all these jobs because the war was about to start in 1939. They were the ones that were getting first privileges in these certain industries, in these certain jobs. And if you weren't in part of the clique, if you weren't part of the union, which many of the blacks were not, then you were out of luck. And then ultimately by 1938, they federalized the minimum wage. It wasn't just certain industries like they were doing before, but now they made it a thing. Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And then when Lyndon Johnson comes into power, what does he do? His Great Society programs, they incentivize not working. It incentivizes not having a male in the house. It incentivizes all these things that all they essentially do is break up the family.
Again, I'm quoting you. Arguably the most consequential of these was the decline in two-parent families.
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that one. Among African Americans.
Yes.
We're still talking about African Americans.
Well, you know, when they talk about things like this, they talk about the legacy of slavery.
Right, right.
And I argue, well, empirically, it's not that, it's the legacy of the welfare state. Because as of 1960, which is almost 100 years after slavery ended, the majority of black kids were being raised in two-parent households. But within one generation after the welfare state, that had dropped down to a minority. So that the majority of black kids today are raised in one-parent households. When you think about it, I mean, centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the black family. But one generation of the welfare state did.
And there is also Bill Clinton, the Democrat, his crime bill of 1993, which contributed to the prison industrial complex. But don't look, Republicans, you can get it too, because even if you go all the way back to Lincoln, see, the Republicans weren't mostly, for the most part, were not anti-slavery for the simple fact that they were moral. Republicans were anti-slavery for the fact that they were industrialists. And industrialization of the country and the agrarianization of the country were incompatible with one another. So the industrialists wanted to dismantle the agriculturalists by any means necessary. And the way to do that is you take away their property. And who were their property? Their property was their slaves. Okay? So Lincoln even said it himself, if I can save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would. If I can save the Union with freeing some and leaving others, I would also do that. If I can save the Union with freeing all the slaves, I would also do that. Lincoln was not really all about freeing the slaves. He didn't want it to expand into the new territories that we continued to gain at that time. But he wasn't really about ending slavery. Because honestly, like, the cotton textile industry kind of helped fuel the industrialization with the textile industries in the North. Okay, so this is something you got to keep in mind here. Lincoln even said it himself. He thought blacks were inferior to whites. He believed that blacks should be exiled outside of the country. He talked about sending them off to Liberia. Lincoln talked about sending them to Haiti, Santo Domingo, British Honduras, and Panama. These were some of the countries that were on the list of countries where Lincoln wanted to send black folks. Okay, so don't get it twisted. He was not your friend. All right, African Americans fought, died, struggled to free themselves. In the early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt, he and his Congress eventually passed the Food Drug Administration Act. The FDA was introduced, and a lot of your conjure doctors, root doctors, your spiritualists, and a lot of these black communities throughout the United States were put out of a job because they weren't sanctioned under these new rules. And this is what you end up having, is people start to abandon traditional doctors or traditional medicines or traditional way of being to go into the corporate, the government-sanctioned medicines, which don't always have your best interest at hand. So if you can get your own land, then I think you can be independent spiritually and mentally and physically. Fast forward a little bit, go to 1964. Now, Lyndon Johnson, as much dirt as he may have done, Lyndon Johnson did something that was able to garner votes. And there's even a quote floating around online. I'm not sure if it's true or not. Some people say it's not true. That Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he said, "I'll have these niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Now, even if he didn't say that, I think, I don't know. Is he right? Now, check this out. In 1964, this same time when most southern white people were actually Democrats, there was a politician from Arizona by the name of Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater was a senator who was a Republican. So Barry Goldwater, he didn't support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So guess what happens? All these same southern states, like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the usual, they don't support the Democratic Party anymore. They switch over to the Republican side and vote Barry Goldwater in that election. Lyndon Johnson wins by a landslide. But in the next 4 years, these same southern states, that Cotton Kingdom belt, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, the usual, they, instead of voting for the Democratic Party, now they try their shot at the Independent Party, which was a segregationist ticket. They fail once again. But then this is when in 1968 or 1972, Nixon's not using these terms such as, he's not saying the N-word in public, he's not doing all these things, but he's using terms like law and order. We need to crack down on crime, etc., etc., etc. This is the way the Republicans were able to appeal to an America that had these anti-black sentiments at the time.
President Nixon told his special counsel, Chuck Colson, that even though he believed abortion encouraged permissiveness, it shouldn't always be out of the question.
Now, if you go look at Nixon's record on race, you'll see some things interesting as well. Nixon was the first one that you really start to hear coining the term the war on drugs, right? This, under his administration, you see the FBI being used to break up organizations like the Black Panthers, etc. I was also under Johnson's administration as well. The White House Domestic Affairs Advisor to Richard Nixon, his name was John Ehrlichman. He stated, Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. This is what he said about the president. And this is what the president was saying, the Republican president was saying behind closed doors. So after this time period, you have the war on drugs going as far back as 1971. You have the creation of the SWAT teams in the 1960s, the ATF in 1972. Right, SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Then by 1981, with the election of Ronald Reagan, you start to have the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act, MCLEA, where they're basically local police officers are getting training and getting weaponry and getting all these things from the military. The regular civilian population are being treated like a foreign enemy.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country. I have been trying to get this out for 18 years, and I have the evidence. My question for you is very specific, sir. If in the course of the IG's investigations and Fred Hitz's work, you come across evidence of severely criminal activity,
let him speak into
and it's classified, will you use that classification to hide the criminal activity, or will you tell the American people the truth?
You have the militarization of the police. You have what they call no-knock raids, right? All these things go against our amendment rights, the 4th Amendment rights, the right not to have your things searched and have your things taken without any due process under the law or without any search warrant. You have what they call civil asset forfeiture, which is a crime in itself. Civil asset forfeiture basically says that if police suspect that the things that you have on your person are associated with drugs in any way, then they can confiscate those things. They can confiscate the money, they can confiscate your jewelry, your car, your house, everything with civil asset forfeiture. Now the logic behind this is that they're thinking that, well, drug dealers have a lot of power within their neighborhoods and they can easily pay off people to keep them silent, to keep them hidden, or whatever. But the civil asset forfeiture is supposed to weaken the drug dealer's power in order to do those kinds of things. So civil asset forfeiture, under the guise that they're looking out for the community, it's designed to weaken the drug dealer in that sense. But what the civil asset forfeiture ends up really doing is it creates a pillaging kind of police force in which officers can go and knock down people's doors if they suspect the person of selling drugs, take everything associated with it, and then have no type of recourse under the law, because once those things are confiscated and taken, civil asset forfeiture means you have no right to get those things back. This goes against all of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. These things were imposed by Republicans. Okay? So when no matter if you're looking at the Democrat side or the Republican side, they all seem to be the same.
This is the year when all of the white politicians are going to come into the Negro community. You never see them until election time. You can't find them until election time. They're going to come in with false promises. And as they make these false promises, they're going to feed our frustrations. And this will only serve to make matters worse. I'm no politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats. One of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican, nor an American. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any block, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they've brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a chump.
And this is why I say to be anti-state. This is why me personally, the Libertarian Party might, it sounds better to someone who has maroon ancestors, someone who has African ancestors, someone who has Rastafarian kind of connection. Sounds better. The state never did you any good, as much as they act like they do you favors.
If white immigrants can come to this country 50 years ago with nickels and dimes and no education, and come here and pool their little nickels and dimes and no education, and set up little stores, develop these stores into larger stores, develop this into an industry which creates job opportunities for whites. Since Lincoln was supposed to have freed the black man 100 years ago, and today the black man, according to the government economists, has spending power of $20 billion per year. We feel that with the black man spending $20 billion a year, not setting up any businesses, not creating any industry, not creating any job opportunities for his own kind, he's not in a moral position to point the finger today at the white man and tell the white man that he's discriminating against him for not giving him a job in factories that he himself set up. If the black man has $20 billion, and these so-called Negro leaders are such geniuses that they can integrate white restaurants and integrate white factories and force themselves into that which the white man has set up, they should use this same ingenuity to show the black people how to pool our wealth and set up something of our own. And then we won't have to force our way into his anymore. One more thing I would like to point out concerning what he said about 125th Street. We don't waste our time on 125th Street, but you can reach more people in the street who want to change than you can in the bourgeoisie society, the bourgeoisie church, and the bourgeoisie circles. Our program is directed toward the man in the street. So we spend our time in the street, and what we do with that man, instead of trying to change the white man in your mind, make you accept us, we change the mind of the black man and make him accept himself. And as soon as he accepts himself, he'll solve his own problem. He won't be trying to force himself into your factory and into your bedroom and into your kitchen. Land is the basis of all independence.